The silence inside the tent was so thick I could hear every beat of my heart echoing like a drum. Garrett had just whispered words that would transform our 8-year friendship into something completely unrecognizable. I love you, Oliver. Not as a friend. I've been in love with you for so long I can't pretend anymore. And there, lying in the dark of the Colorado mountains, I discovered that some confessions have the power to rewrite the entire story you thought you knew. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like to get access to more stories like this. My name is Oliver Mitchell, I'm 24 years old, and I work as a financial analyst at one of the largest investment firms in Denver. If you've ever spent your days trapped between endless spreadsheets, reports that seem to have no end, and bosses who believe you're a results-producing machine, then you know exactly the routine that dominates my life. I wake up at 5:30 in the morning, drink a black coffee that feels more like industrial fuel, and surrender myself to a world where numbers are more important than people, and where success is measured by the ability to turn data into profit. But there's something about this life that deeply bothers me. It's as if I'm watching my own existence through a foggy window, observing a character who looks like me but has nothing to do with who I really am. Sometimes, in the middle of an important meeting, I catch myself wondering if this is really the path I chose, or if I simply let myself be carried away by the current of other people's expectations. I live alone in a downtown apartment, a modern and cold space that looks more like a home decor magazine showroom than a home. The white walls reflect an organized life, but one that's empty of true substance. The only real constant amidst all this corporate chaos is my friendship with Garrett Thompson. We met in college, when we were still naive enough to believe the world was waiting for us with open arms. Garrett has always been my safe harbor, the person I can vent to about work frustrations, share genuine laughs with, and most importantly, be myself with no masks or professional performances. He has this rare ability to make anyone feel truly seen and heard, as if their words are the only ones that matter in the universe at that moment. What you hear here is just the beginning. The full, unfiltered stories with all the details you can imagine are available now. See the link in the description right now. If you've ever had that friend who knows your deepest fears and still chooses to stay by your side, leave a like on this video. You'll perfectly understand the transformative journey Oliver was about to embark on. Garrett suggested this camping trip in March, when Denver's winter was still biting our faces with relentless cruelty. "Dude, we need to get out of this urban madness," he said, pointing to my apartment window where snow covered everything with a gray and depressing blanket. "How about we restart our camping tradition? It's been 2 years since we did it." He wasn't wrong. Our last adventure in nature had been interrupted by professional commitments, relationships that didn't work out, and the natural inertia of adults who forget the importance of breathing fresh air away from computer screens. The idea of spending an entire weekend in the Colorado Rocky Mountains sounded like an oasis in the middle of the desert of responsibilities my life had become. Garrett chose a specific location, a remote camping area 3 hours from Denver, surrounded by ancient pine trees and with a privileged view of a lake that, according to him, had waters so clear you could see the bottom even in the deepest parts. "It's the perfect place to completely disconnect," he assured me with an enthusiasm that immediately infected me. When we finally arrived at the destination that Friday in June, I understood exactly what Garrett meant. The mountain air has an almost magical quality. Pure, fresh, loaded with the unmistakable scent of pine and damp earth that penetrates your lungs like a warm hug from nature. The gentle sound of the lake water lapping softly against the rocks on the shore created a natural soundtrack that immediately calmed my agitated mind. It was as if each wave whispered ancient secrets about the importance of slowing down and simply existing. The distant singing of birds completed this natural symphony, mixing with the almost imperceptible rustle of the wind through the pine branches. The golden light of the late afternoon filtered through the canopy of the trees, creating a play of shadows and light that transformed the entire environment into something out of an impressionist painting. It was impossible not to feel a deep sense of peace taking over every fiber of my being. Our camping routine was established naturally, as if it had been a choreography rehearsed for years. We set up the tent in a sheltered clearing, organized our gear with the precision of veterans, and built a campfire that became the gravitational center of our small temporary universe. Garrett had brought local craft beers, while I contributed ingredients for us to prepare simple but tasty meals on the portable stove. We established a sacred rule: no cell phones, no work, just 2 days of total rest dedicated to reconnecting with nature and ourselves. This annual trip was a tradition we had maintained since our college days, a kind of renewal ritual that allowed us to temporarily escape the pressures of the adult world and remember who we were before professional responsibilities began to shape our identities. It was our time to go back to being just Oliver and Garrett, two friends who shared stories, laughs, and the conviction that, no matter how complicated life became, we would always have each other as an anchor. But on that first night, something was different. I noticed it during our usual ritual around the campfire, when the flames danced hypnotically between us and the stars began to appear in the dark mountain sky. Garrett seemed more introspective than usual, his eyes fixed on the fire with an intensity I had never noticed before. Between sips of beer, he made comments that sounded loaded with hidden meanings, as if he was testing the waters for a deeper conversation. Have you ever wondered if you're living the life you really want? The question came out of his lips with a seriousness that caught me off guard. Normally, our conversations around the campfire were relaxed, full of inside jokes and shared college memories. But there was something in the way he phrased that question, an emotional weight that made my stomach clench slightly. "What do you mean?" I replied, trying to maintain a casual tone while observing his expression in the flickering firelight. Garrett shifted his gaze from the fire and looked directly at me, his eyes reflecting a vulnerability that made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't explain. "You know, sometimes I feel like we're all playing roles that other people wrote for us," he continued, his voice gaining an almost confessional quality. "Work, relationships, social expectations. It's like we're hiding who we really are for fear of not being accepted." The words hung in the air between us like smoke, loaded with a raw honesty that transformed the relaxed atmosphere into something much denser and more significant. I tried to process what he was saying, but there were layers in his speech that I couldn't fully decode. Garrett was always more emotional and philosophical than me, but this conversation seemed to carry a subtext that escaped me. There was an urgency in his voice, as if these words had been stuck in his throat for a long time and finally found an opportunity to escape. Garrett Thompson is 25 years old and works as a mechanical engineer at a renewable energy company in Denver. While I struggle daily with numbers and financial analysis, he dedicates his days to designing sustainable solutions for a world that desperately needs clean energy alternatives. There's something deeply satisfying in knowing that your work contributes directly to a better future, something I always secretly envied in our friendship. Physically, Garrett has that kind of presence that naturally attracts attention without him having to try. Tall, with broad shoulders shaped by years of outdoor activities. He has the kind of look that makes people turn their heads when he walks down the street. His brown eyes have a depth that suggests layers of thoughts and emotions he rarely shares completely, and his smile has the power to light up any room, making even strangers instantly feel at ease in his presence. But what I admire most about Garrett is his genuine ability to connect with people on a deep and authentic level. He has this rare skill to make anyone feel like their words, their fears, and their dreams are the most important things in the world at that specific moment. He's an exceptional listener, someone who not only hears the words you say, but also understands the silences between them, the unsaid emotions that hide in the subtext of every conversation. Our friendship was forged during the turbulent years of college, when we were still figuring out who we were and what kind of adults we wanted to become. Garrett was my roommate in our second year, and what started as a housing convenience quickly transformed into one of the most important relationships of my life. He was there during my first heartbreak, celebrated with me when I got my first job, and was always the person I ran to when I needed advice or simply someone who understood my peculiar way of seeing the world. What always intrigued me about Garrett is his apparent ease in forming deep connections with pretty much anyone he crosses paths with. While I tend to be more reserved and cautious in my interpersonal relationships, he has a social naturalness that makes even the most introverted people open up in his presence. It's as if he has a master key to human hearts, an innate ability to find the exact point where vulnerability transforms into genuine intimacy. During our second night of camping, after an entire Saturday dedicated to activities that reconnected us with the simplicity of natural life, I began to notice nuances in his behavior that left me slightly uneasy. We spent the morning hiking around the lake, our feet finding a synchronized rhythm as we talked about college memories, future plans, and life philosophies we rarely discussed amidst the urban chaos of Denver. During breakfast prep, when we were organizing the utensils on the camping table, our hands touched briefly as we reached for the same pan. It was a completely accidental contact, the kind of thing that happens thousands of times between close friends without any special meaning. But Garrett held the touch for a second longer than normal, his fingers lingering on mine with a delicacy that made my heart race in a way I couldn't explain at the time. Later, when I settled in the shade of a pine tree to read a book I had brought specifically for that moment of rest. I noticed Garrett observing me with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't just the casual look of a friend checking on the other's well-being, but something more intense, more loaded with meaning. There was a contemplation in his eyes, as if he was memorizing every detail of my face, every expression, every unconscious movement I made while I was focused on reading. When our eyes met, he quickly looked away, pretending to be interested in something distant on the horizon of the lake. But I had captured that moment of vulnerability in his expression, a momentary window into something he kept carefully guarded. It was as if he was struggling internally with some thought or feeling he couldn't or didn't dare to express. The silences between us, which were always comfortable and natural, began to acquire a different quality. There was an emotional density hanging in the air, as if unspoken words were accumulating between us, creating a subtle but perceptible tension that transformed even the most mundane moments into something loaded with hidden meaning. During lunch, while we shared simple sandwiches and fresh lake water, Garrett made seemingly casual comments about relationships and the difficulty of finding people who truly understand us on a deep level. "It's funny how we can be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone," he said, distractedly playing with a twig he had found on the ground. "But you've never had a problem connecting with people," I replied, genuinely confused by the melancholy in his voice. "Everyone loves your company, Garrett. You have this natural gift for making people feel special." He laughed, but there was a subtle bitterness in that sound that didn't match his usually optimistic personality. "Connecting superficially is easy," he said, finally looking directly at me. "The challenge is finding someone you can be completely honest with about who you really are, without fear of judgment or rejection." His words carried a weight that suggested painful personal experiences, layers of his emotional life that he had never shared with me, despite our intimate friendship. I began to realize that, as close as we were, there were aspects of Garrett that remained carefully protected, emotional territories he hadn't allowed me access to. But it was during the preparations for our second night that I really began to feel that something fundamental was changing between us. As we organized our sleeping bags inside the tent, Garrett made a point of positioning his closer to mine than our usual practice was. When I casually commented on it, he simply said he was feeling cold and that the proximity would help maintain body heat during the night. The explanation was perfectly logical and practical, but there was something in the way he avoided my gaze while giving it that made me question if his motivations were really as simple as they seemed. It was as if every gesture, every word, every silence was loaded with hidden meanings that I couldn't fully decode, but that my intuition captured as signs of an approaching emotional storm. That night, as we lay in our sleeping bags side by side in the cozy darkness of the tent, I could feel the tension emanating from Garrett's body like heat waves. His breathing was irregular, and he moved restlessly, as if he was struggling internally with some important decision. The silence between us was different from all the other nights we had shared over the years. It was charged, expectant, as if the entire universe was holding its breath, waiting for something that would change everything forever. It was then, in that dense darkness of the Colorado mountains, with only the distant sound of the wind through the pines as a soundtrack, that Garrett finally found the courage to break the silence with words that completely rewrote the story of our friendship. "Oliver, I need to tell you something I've been holding on to for years." The darkness inside the tent seemed to have gained a physical density, as if every word from Garrett was materializing a completely new reality around us. "I love you, Oliver. Not as a friend. I've been in love with you for so long I can't pretend anymore." His words echoed in the confined space like sacred confessions whispered in an empty cathedral. My heart raced in a way that made my whole body tremble, an explosive mix of shock, confusion, and something deeper that I didn't have the courage to name at the time. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear every beat of my own heart hammering against my ribs as if it wanted to escape my chest. Garrett's breathing was ragged, loaded with a raw vulnerability that made the air between us vibrate with pure emotion. It was as if he had just exposed his soul completely naked, leaving himself at the mercy of my reaction without any protection or defense. "Garrett!" My voice came out as a hoarse whisper, barely able to form his name. Thousands of thoughts bombarded my mind simultaneously. Memories of our friendship began to rearrange themselves under a new perspective, as if someone had completely changed the lenses through which I saw our shared history. All those moments of closeness, the prolonged glances I had attributed to our close friendship, the touches that lasted a second longer than necessary, everything took on a completely different meaning. I know this changes everything, he continued, his voice breaking slightly. I know I probably just destroyed the most important thing in my life. But I can't carry this alone anymore, Oliver. I can't pretend you're just my best friend when, in fact, you're the most important person in my universe in a way that goes far beyond friendship. The brutal honesty of his words cut through all my emotional defenses like a sharp blade. I could feel tears welling up in his eyes, even in the dark, the emotional weight of years of repressed feelings finally finding an outlet after so long trapped in his heart. It was impossible not to be moved by the courage he showed in completely exposing his vulnerability, knowing he could lose everything he valued most in life. How long have you been? I tried to formulate the question, but my own voice failed. It was as if my brain was trying to process information that completely defied my understanding of our relationship and, in a way, my own identity. Years, he replied simply. Since junior year of college, when you stayed with me during that terrible week after my parents got divorced. You didn't just comfort me, Oliver. You saw me completely broken and still chose to stay. In that moment, I realized that what I felt for you was much deeper than admiration or gratitude. It was true love, the kind that fundamentally changes who you are. His words painted such a vivid emotional picture that I could perfectly remember that week. Garrett had been devastated by his parents' separation, and I had spent entire nights comforting him, offering my shoulder for him to cry on, and my constant presence so he would know he wasn't alone. At the time, it had been a natural demonstration of loyalty between best friends. Now, understanding that for him, it had been the moment when friendship turned into love completely changed the texture of those memories. I watched you date other people all these years, he continued, each word loaded with a pain I could physically feel in the air between us. I pretended I was happy for you, that I was rooting for your relationships to work out. But inside, I died a little every time you told me about some special date, or when I saw you looking at someone else the way I dreamed you would look at me. The image of Garrett suffering in silence while I shared details of my relationships with him hit me like a punch to the stomach. All those conversations about girls I was meeting, the advice he gave me on how to impress someone I was interested in, the times he comforted me when a romance didn't work out, all of it had been a constant emotional torture for him, and I had no idea. Why didn't you ever say anything before? I asked, genuinely confused about how I had completely missed the signs of something so intense happening right next to me. Because I was afraid, he replied with an honesty that made my throat clench. Afraid of losing you completely. Afraid that you would look at me differently, treat me differently. Our friendship has always been the most precious thing in my life, Oliver. It was better to have you as my best friend, even suffering in silence, than to risk not having you at all. The tears that had formed in my eyes finally began to stream down my face. They weren't tears of sadness, but of a complex emotion that mixed compassion, guilt, and something I couldn't completely identify. To see the person I loved most in the world, even if platonically, revealing years of silent suffering was gut-wrenching in a way I had never experienced before. Garrett, I tried again, but he interrupted me softly. You don't have to say anything right now, he whispered. I just needed you to know. I just needed to finally be honest, even if it means losing everything. But I didn't want him to feel rejected before I even had the chance to fully process what was happening. There was something in the absolute vulnerability of his confession that awakened a tenderness in me that transcended any category of feeling I knew. Without consciously thinking, I reached out in the dark until I found his hand. The touch was electric, making every nerve ending in my body awaken in a completely new way. Our fingers intertwined slowly, like two rivers converging to form something bigger than their individual parts. I could feel the tremor in his hand, the mixture of hope and fear that ran through his body like an electric current. It was a moment of connection so pure and intense that it seemed to have its own gravitational field, pulling us into a completely unexplored emotional territory. Sometimes I wondered, I admitted in a whisper so low I was barely sure I had said it aloud. It was the first time I had verbalized thoughts that I had buried so deeply in my consciousness that I didn't even know they existed. There were moments over the years, fleeting seconds of curiosity or questioning, that I had immediately suppressed because they didn't fit the narrative I had built about my own identity. Garrett moved slightly closer, and I could feel the warmth emanating from his body like a tangible aura. Oliver, he whispered my name as if it were a prayer, loaded with years of repressed desire and cautious hope. It was the first time I had heard my own name said with so much love and reverence, as if each syllable was too precious to be wasted. His hands found my face in the dark, fingers delicately tracing the outline of my jaw like a blind sculptor discovering his masterpiece through touch. It was a gesture of such profound tenderness that it made every emotional defense I had completely disintegrate. There was no urgency or desperation in his movements, just a silent reverence, as if he was memorizing through touch every inch of my face. When our lips finally met, it was as if the whole world had paused to witness that moment of transformation. The kiss started hesitantly, two people carefully testing if it was possible to cross the line between friendship and something completely different without destroying everything that already existed between them. It was soft, questioning, like a whispered question in a language neither of us had yet mastered completely. But as the seconds passed, the kiss deepened, transforming into a silent conversation of years of feelings stored up. There was a growing urgency, but not a sexual one. It was emotional. The desperate need to communicate through touch everything that words couldn't adequately express. It was as if two violin strings were being played in perfect harmony, creating a symphony that existed only in that sacred space between us. My hands, acting with a will of their own that my rational mind couldn't control, began to explore forbidden territories. First his chest through his cotton t-shirt, feeling the acceleration of his heart under the palm of my hand. Then his back, mapping every muscle, every contour, as if I was creating a completely new atlas of sensations. It was like discovering an entire continent that had always existed next to me, but that I had never had permission to explore. Garrett responded with equally reverent touches, his hands running over my body with a familiarity that suggested he had imagined these moments thousands of times. There was a precision in his movements, as if he knew exactly where to touch to make my skin tingle, where to apply pressure to make my entire body vibrate with an energy I had never experienced before. The heat between us gradually intensified, turning the inside of the tent into our own private universe where only the two of us existed. It was as if we had created a temporal bubble where the past and future completely lost their relevance, leaving only that infinite moment of mutual discovery. Each kiss deepened, each touch became more daring, each whisper carried more intimacy. When we finally separated to breathe, we remained lying side by side, breaths gradually normalizing as we processed the magnitude of what had just happened between us. The air inside the tent seemed to carry a completely different energy, as if the molecules themselves had been rearranged by the emotional intensity we had shared. Garrett extended his arm and pulled me closer, my head finding his chest where I could still hear his heart beating fast. It was a position of intimacy that transcended any simple category. It wasn't just physical, but emotional, spiritual even. It was as if we had found a completely new form of language, a way to communicate that existed beyond the limitations of words. "Thank you," he whispered against my hair, his voice loaded with such deep gratitude that it made my throat clench again. "Thank you for not immediately rejecting me. Thank you for letting me show you how much you mean to me." But even as I absorbed the warmth of his body and the tenderness in his voice, a part of my mind began to process the implications of what had just happened. It was as if a part of me was observing the scene from the outside, trying to understand how Oliver, the straight financial analyst I had known for 24 years, had arrived at that moment of intense intimacy with his best friend. I remained silent, not because I didn't want to answer, but because I didn't have adequate words to express the emotional complexity I was experiencing. It was a mix of genuine tenderness for Garrett, confusion about my own feelings, and a growing awareness that our friendship had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. No matter what happened from that moment on, we couldn't pretend we were just best friends anymore. Eventually, the emotional and physical exhaustion of the day overcame us. We fell asleep intertwined, but my sleep was restless, populated by fragmented dreams and a constant feeling that something fundamental had changed about who I was. Even unconsciously, my mind couldn't stop processing the emotional revolution I had just experienced. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I noticed was that Garrett was already awake, watching me with an expression that mixed cautious hope with palpable fear. The golden morning light filtered through the tent canvas, creating a magical atmosphere, but I could feel a tension in the air that hadn't existed the night before. "Good morning," he said softly, but there was a hesitation in his voice that made me realize he was trying to decipher my reaction in the light of day. It was as if he was wondering if the magic of the previous night would survive the morning's rationality. "Good morning," I replied, but my own voice sounded strange to my ears, loaded with a formality that didn't match the intimacy we had shared hours earlier. It was as if a part of me was trying to return to the familiar territory of our traditional friendship, while another part was still processing the completely new sensations and emotions that had been awakened. We got out of the tent and started our morning routine of making coffee and breakfast, but every movement seemed loaded with meaning. When our hands accidentally touched as we reached for the same cup, we both pulled back quickly, as if physical contact had become something dangerous in the light of day. It was obvious that we were both trying to process what had happened and what it meant for our future. I spent most of the morning walking alone around the lake, needing space to organize my thoughts. The clear waters perfectly reflected the mountains and the blue sky, creating a visual symmetry that completely contrasted with the emotional chaos that dominated my mind. It was ironic how nature could remain so serene and unchanging, while my inner world had been completely revolutionized in a single night. As I walked, I tried to honestly examine my feelings about what had happened. I couldn't deny that I had felt something powerful and real during our intimate moment. It had been intense, emotional, even transformative in a way. But as the hours passed and my rational mind regained control, I began to realize a painful truth. As genuine as my emotional response to Garrett's vulnerability had been, it hadn't fundamentally changed who I was or what I felt for him on the deepest level. I loved Garrett deeply and sincerely, but it was a brotherly love, the love of a best friend who valued the person he was above all else. The emotional intensity of the previous night had been real, but it had been fueled more by compassion, by the tenderness I felt seeing him so vulnerable, and by the newness of the experience than by a genuine change in the nature of my romantic feelings. When I returned to the campsite, I found Garrett methodically organizing our gear, an activity clearly designed to keep his hands and mind busy while he waited for my reaction. He looked at me with a cautious expectation, and I realized the time had come for one of the most difficult conversations of my life. "Garrett," I began, my voice more shaky than I would have liked. He immediately stopped organizing the gear and turned to face me directly, his brown eyes searching for a clue about what I was about to say. I could see the mix of hope and terror in his expression, as if he was preparing for both the best and the worst news of his life. "I have to be honest with you," I continued, feeling every word leave my throat like glass shards. "What happened last night, it was special. It was intense and real in a way I never imagined I could experience. But it didn't fundamentally change who I am." I saw the light slowly go out in his eyes, as if I was watching a sunset in slow motion. Garrett lowered his head, his hands trembling slightly as he processed what I was saying. It was excruciating to watch someone I loved so much begin to fall apart right in front of me, knowing I was the direct cause of his pain. "You're the most important person in my life," I continued desperately, trying to soften the blow I knew was inevitable. "I love you deeply, Garrett, but I love you like a brother, like a best friend. What we felt yesterday was real, but it wasn't romantic love on my part. It was compassion, tenderness for seeing you so vulnerable." The words hung in the air between us like a death sentence. Garrett remained silent for long minutes, his shoulders hunched as if the weight of my words was physically crushing him. When he finally looked up at me, there was a painful acceptance in his eyes that was even harder to bear than the previous hope. "I knew," he said in a hoarse voice. "Deep down, I always knew. But I had to try, Oliver. I couldn't live the rest of my life wondering, what if?" He took a deep breath, trying to compose himself. "Thank you for being honest. Thank you for not rejecting me immediately last night. It means more than you can imagine." The emotional maturity with which he received my brutal honesty only intensified my pain. It was typical of Garrett, always putting the well-being of others above his own, even when he was being torn apart inside. I wanted to hug him, to comfort him, but I knew that any physical gesture at that moment would only intensify his confusion and pain. The rest of that morning was marked by a heavy and awkward silence that had never existed between us before. We dismantled the camp with a mechanical efficiency, each one carefully avoiding any direct eye contact or accidental physical contact. It was as if we were playing the roles of two people who vaguely knew each other, not of best friends who had shared years of emotional intimacy. During the drive back to Denver, the tension inside the car was almost suffocating. The radio remained off, leaving only the monotonous sound of the engine and tires on the road as a soundtrack to our mutual discomfort. I tried a few times to start casual conversations about work or plans for the week, but each attempt died quickly in monosyllabic answers from Garrett. The most painful moment came when my cell phone vibrated with a message from Zoe, the girl I had been casually dating for a few weeks. It was a sweet message asking about my trip and saying she was looking forward to seeing me when I got back. I instinctively smiled as I read it, and when I looked to the side, I saw Garrett observing my reaction with such an intense expression of pain that I felt my stomach clench. In that moment, the reality of the situation hit me with full force. It wasn't just that I didn't reciprocate Garrett's romantic feelings. I was actively interested in someone else, someone who represented everything he couldn't be for me. It was as if I was rubbing salt in an already painful wound, and I hadn't even done it intentionally. When we arrived at my apartment, the goodbye was more formal and cold than any interaction we had had in 8 years of friendship. "Thanks for the trip," I said inadequately, as if we were just polite acquaintances. Garrett nodded, mumbled something about talking soon, but we both knew it was a polite lie. Something fundamental had broken between us, and there was no instruction manual on how to fix that kind of damage. In the weeks that followed, our communication was reduced to sporadic and completely superficial text messages. Garrett began to politely decline our usual get-togethers, always with plausible excuses about work or other commitments. Gradually, our intimate friendship transformed into minimal contact, as if we were two strangers who occasionally crossed paths on social media. The pain of the loss was constant and penetrating. I had lost not just my best friend, but an essential part of who I was. Garrett had been my emotional anchor, my confidant, the person I shared life's joys and sorrows with. His absence created a void that no other relationship could adequately fill. 6 months later, as I sit in my silent apartment, reflecting on everything that happened on that transformative trip, I finally understand the devastating complexity of unrequited love. I discovered that sometimes true love doesn't bring people closer. It can reveal invisible lines that, when crossed, leave permanent scars on the emotional landscape of a relationship. Garrett wasn't wrong for falling in love with me, just as I wasn't wrong for not being able to reciprocate those feelings. Love, I learned in the most painful way possible, doesn't follow the logic of reciprocity or justice. It simply exists, wild and untamable, transforming lives and destroying certainties without asking for permission or offering guarantees. Emotional honesty, while necessary, doesn't always lead to the happy endings Hollywood promised us. Some truths are like earthquakes. They reveal tectonic faults that have always existed beneath the surface, but that remained hidden until the pressure became unbearable. Our friendship had one of those faults, and Garrett's confession was the tremor that finally exposed it. Today, I still miss him daily. I miss our conversations, his laugh, the way he could make me feel understood, even when I didn't completely understand myself. I miss the person he was before unrequited love created an impassable distance between us. Some people would say that I should have lied that morning at the campsite, that I should have given a chance to something that could have developed over time. But I deeply believe that honesty, even when it hurts terribly, is always the most respectful path. Garrett deserved my truth, just as he deserved the freedom to move on and find someone capable of loving him the way he needed to be loved. The most painful lesson I learned is that not all types of love are compatible, and that some of the most precious relationships in our lives can be destroyed by the very intensity of the feelings they inspire. Platonic love and romantic love occupy different territories of the human soul, and forcing a transition between them can result in the complete loss of both. What you hear here is just the beginning. The full, unfiltered stories with all the details you can imagine are available now. See the link in the description right now. If this story has touched you in some way, if you have ever experienced something similar or are curious about how love can transform and sometimes destroy the most important relationships in our lives, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell to not miss the next chapters of this emotional journey. In the comments, tell me, do you believe some friendships can survive confessions like this? Or does unrequited love always leave permanent scars? Your experience and perspective can help other people navigating similar situations. Until the next story, where we will continue to explore the most complex and vulnerable territories of the human heart.